This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 198 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we will be exploring some fantastic online spaces where you can learn real history in our current anti-CRT era. We are living in a time where a segment of the population is working as hard as it can to keep our students ignorant of history. Dozens of states are attempting to erase history from textbooks and curriculum if it paints certain populations in an unflattering light. And teachers' jobs are under threat in many places if they teach certain concepts. This is no accident. It's happening at a time when more excellent work than ever before is being published to accurately and inclusively represent history. While history books written for schools have always been heavily edited, and for generations, many of the most atrocious aspects of our history amounted to little more than a quick paragraph in most of them, other materials have come along that examine history through a more critical and inclusive lens. And that stuff, thankfully, can be found on the internet, which is still available in all 50 states, for now anyway. If you are a student or parent living in a place where history is under attack, and you want to give yourself or your child the education that your legislators are trying to take from you, the 9 outstanding resources in this episode are for you. Before we get started, I'd like to thank EverFi for sponsoring this episode. Do you want to prepare your students for career and life success, but you're short on time? Busy teachers use EverFi's standards-aligned, ready-made digital lessons to teach students to thrive in an ever-changing world. Interactive, game-based lessons designed by experienced educators help you engage students at all grade levels and bring critical real-world skills like financial readiness, emotional literacy, STEM, and much more to your classroom. Thanks to their partners, all K-12 schools and students have access to EverFi's lessons free of charge. Join the 60,000 plus teachers who used EverFi's award-winning lessons this past school year to serve over 5.5 million students. With back-to-school season officially in full swing, now is an exciting time to give your students a jump start on their future. Go to cultofpedagogy.com/everfi, that's EVERFI, and sign up to get a virtual swag bag full of free goodies to get the school year off to a great start. Support also comes from Studio. Today by Studio is a planning tool that allows students to track and plan all of their classwork by estimating how much time a task will take and dividing larger tasks into smaller steps. Teachers can track how each student is handling their workload over time. This is a valuable tool to support parent conversations and help each student plan their work and pace themselves. And coaching students on better organization has a direct impact on their grades as well as their long-term success. Today offers a free plan for individual students and parents to enter their own tasks. With an inexpensive subscription, schoolwork from Google Classroom can be automatically imported. And school and district plans come with added features like timetable import, workload management, and more LMS integrations. Visit studio.co/pedagogy, that's studio.co/pedagogy to create your free account now and get your students planning. So before I share these resources, I want to tell you where they came from, because when I first started to hear about all of these laws that were trying to go into effect in different states to heavily censor history, I thought about a resource that I make every year called the Teacher's Guide to Tech, which is a PDF. It's a digital encyclopedia of all the tech tools out there that have anything to do with education, and we've got them broken into sections. There's a section on assessment tools, there's a section on feedback tools, there's a section on presentation tools, and we also have a math section, a writing section, and we have a history and social studies section. So when I started to hear about this, I thought, well, there's a lot of really great curriculum that's just free and available online for anybody to access no matter where they live. So that's where I pulled these from. So if you wanted to see the whole guide, you just go to teachersguidetotech.com and you can see and purchase that guide for yourself, for your school, and so on. But that's where these are coming from. So most of what I'm going to share here are websites that contain educational materials like readings, videos, images, primary sources, and a lot of them have lesson plans for teachers. Ideally, they would all offer materials that anyone could use to teach history to themselves. Since the students I'm reaching out to here have teachers who literally aren't allowed to use them. But I think with a little creativity, that self-teaching can still happen. Either you can just sort of imagine the parts where there's supposed to be a class discussion about something, or ask yourself the questions that the teacher in a lesson plan is being directed to ask. I'm also imagining other scenarios where maybe a group of teachers, maybe a group of former teachers in Texas, for example, starts a kind of underground after-school program using these materials. Just throwing out ideas. So I don't have a history education background myself, so it is likely that I will neglect to mention some important aspects of the sites that I'm sharing here. If I overlook any notable features, or if you know of other free history resources that are worth a look, please come to the blog post over on Cult of Pedagogy. Just go to Cult of Pedagogy, click podcast, and then choose episode 198, and that'll take you right to where I've got all this stuff listed on a post, and just add it to the comments. And then that way I'll have my stuff in the post, and then we can just keep building the collection through the comments that other people also add. So I've got 9 resources that I'm going to share, and the first one is the 1619 Project. I think if any resource belongs at the top of a list like this one of history that is being suppressed, it is the 1619 Project. This project started in August of 2019 by Nicole Hannah Jones as a special issue of the New York Times Magazine, a collection of essays and other creative works that illuminates the legacy of slavery in the contemporary United States and highlights the contributions of Black Americans to every aspect of American society. That last part comes from their website. So while the project was celebrated by many, it was also the target of criticism from conservatives, and this eventually grew into what we now know to be the anti-CRT movement, with some states specifically banning the use of this project. Despite the pushback, the project has continued to expand. It now includes a podcast, a book-length anthology, a children's book, and a curriculum that teachers can use to teach the 1619 Project in schools. Now, for every one of the resources that I'm giving you, I am also going to mention one piece of it that I'm just calling a sample to sort of suggest that you go to if you want to just get a taste of what each of these resources has to offer. So the sample that I would recommend that you go to for this one is that you actually use the free reading guide that you can download to actually work your way through the essays and the other creative works in the original full issue of the project as it appeared in the New York Times Magazine. And that is just a free PDF that you can download that shows you how it originally appeared in the magazine. Another way to sort of sample the project is to use the listening guide, which is another free download, to supplement your listening of the 1619 podcast. So there's a lot of ways to just get a taste of what this project has to offer. So that's the 1619 Project. The second one is the Zinn Education Project. The materials on this website are built through the lens of history, highlighted in Howard Zinn's best-selling book, A People's History of the United States. And this book has been around for decades. So it's built sort of based around his philosophy and his approach. This is how they explain their approach on the website. Quote, "When we look at history from the standpoint of the workers and not just the owners, the soldiers and not just the generals, the invaded and not just the invaders, we can begin to see society more fully, more accurately. The more clearly we see the past, the more clearly we'll see the present and be equipped to improve it." End quote. The site offers free downloadable teaching materials organized by theme, time period, and reading level. They also offer regular free online trainings and institutes for teachers. So a sample from this one, I said that you can download things and choose them by theme. One of the themes is the labor theme. There is a lesson in there that I thought was interesting on how hospital workers organized in the late 1960s. And then there were also links to primary documents like a worker-run newspaper published by women working in the textile industry in Lowell, Massachusetts in the mid-1800s. So a lot of sort of primary documents that have to do with the early labor movement in the United States. The third resource is Facing History and Ourselves. The creators of Facing History want to go beyond exploring history and current events through a different lens. They also want to develop students' ability to stand up to bigotry and hate as a result of what they learn. The resource library on this site offers a rich collection of free mini lessons, readings, videos, activities, and other materials that anyone can use to teach themselves about topics like racism, genocide, migration and immigration, human and civil rights, and many other topics. And if you're living in a place where these topics are being muted, this may be your only option. But if you are a teacher working in a state with more freedom, you will be able to use their materials in your classroom and take advantage of Facing History's many ongoing professional development opportunities for teachers who want to use their approach. So a sample, which by the way, all of these samples, I have them linked over on that blog post I mentioned. So if you just go to the site, click podcast, go to episode 198, you're going to find links to all this stuff. So one that I thought was interesting is a mini lesson on the rise of anti-Semitism in recent times. The lesson starts by having students do a gallery walk to explore recent incidents of anti-Semitism. And then it moves to a story of a high school teacher who took action against anti-Semitism in her own school. And then students are prompted to consider how this example of what she did might shape their own responses to anti-Semitism in their own communities. So it's a really good example of how not only does this site share stories of marginalized people and injustices, but then turns it around and adds that layer of asking the participants who are learning about it, what could you do about this situation that is still going on in other ways in our world? The next resource is called New American History. And I think based on what I've seen about social media following, I think this one has a slightly smaller following. And so this might be more of a new one to people who know history resources pretty well. New American History's goal is to uncover the untold stories and missing pieces of what we know or thought we already knew about the American past. So we're seeing a similar theme with all of these. This is, telling more of the untold stories. Their approach, I think, is kind of unique. They have a combination of curated journalism. So they do have some of their own pieces that their staff has written, but a lot of it is also pulled from some other places. They also have resources for teachers and students, sort of lesson plans and activities. And then they've also got another section of interactive maps that are incredibly complex and honestly above my head in terms of the ability to understand how they work. But they've got videos and sort of tutorials to help you understand how to use them. But they really show the impact of some of these situations on things like population growth, population movement, etc. I'm going to explain one of them here in just a second. So I've got two samples that I think you should look at from New American History. One is The Lasting Impact of the Trail of Tears, which is a multimedia lesson that explores how the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears impacted Native Americans. And then there's another lesson on gerrymandering and redistricting that includes interactive maps that include data from recent election years. So you can sort of see statistically the impact of things like gerrymandering and redistricting on certain elections. So that one, if you have never heard of it, New American History is one that would be definitely worth taking a look at. So the next one is another one that I think is a little bit less well known. It's called What Does It Mean to Be an American? This site offers free in-depth lessons on 6 topics that explore the overarching question of what it means to be an American. So it's a smaller site, but they go pretty deep with what they have. So the topics include immigration, civil liberties and equity, and civic engagement. I would say these lessons that they're calling them are really more like mini units that would probably take several class periods to teach. And they include videos, readings, activities, and discussion topics. Now, because this site was developed by the Mineta Legacy Project, which is dedicated to celebrating the life and contributions of Norman Mineta, who was the first Japanese American to be elected to Congress, the site contains quite a few resources that are focused on the lives of Japanese Americans. So if that aligns with your curriculum, and now I'm speaking obviously to teachers, or if it just aligns with an area of interest for you, this would be a really good site to go to if that's something. It's not only that, but there's a heavy presence of the stories of Japanese Americans in it. So a sample that I would recommend is the immigration lesson, which includes a reading on migration concepts, which introduces readers to the reasons why people move from one country to another and defines key vocabulary terms. And it also includes a video where students share their own personal immigration stories. And these are contemporary students now talking about their own stories of being immigrants to the United States. So I'm going to just quickly review the ones that we've talked about so far. So we started with the 1619 Project, the Zinn Education Project. Zinn is Z-I-N-N. The third is Facing History and Ourselves. The fourth is New American History. The fifth one is What Does It Mean to Be an American? And then we have 2 that are kind of almost like a pair. They're both podcasts, and they both come from the same place. So one is the Teaching Hard History podcast. This podcast is from the Learning for Justice website, and it brings us the lessons that we, quote, should have learned in school through the voices of leading scholars and educators. Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries, who I interviewed in 2018, which is episode 98, when the podcast first got started, is the host. In every episode, Jeffries draws insights from his own scholarship and shares the platform with many other historians to delve into a specific subtopic within a larger historical era. So the first 2 seasons explore American slavery. Season 3 addresses the civil rights movement, and Season 4 examines the Jim Crow era. Although the podcast is directed at teachers and centers the conversation around classroom practice, it also offers enough fresh historical information to be a powerful learning vehicle for anyone. So a sample of this one, I would recommend trying episode 6 of Season 3, which is called The Jim Crow North. Where Jeffries and historian Patrick Jones look into how the civil rights movement was not just happening in the southern states. So the other podcast is called the Queer America Podcast, and this is also from Learning for Justice. The primary intention of this podcast is to help teachers incorporate LGBTQ plus history into classroom curriculum. Sadly, this may take generations to achieve in some places, but the podcast is available to anyone, anywhere who wants to teach themselves. So a sample of this one, I'd say try episode 6, The Lavender Scare, which looks at the systemic firing of gay government employees that started in the 1950s on the premise that these employees were a threat to national security. This is a period of history I was not aware of, because I was very much aware of like the Red Scare and McCarthyism, but this is another thing that was happening around the exact same time that really targeted the LGBTQ plus population. So 2 more. The 8th resource is the National Museum of African American History and Culture, or the website of that museum. So since the museum first opened in Washington, D.C. in 2016, its website has curated collections of digital resources through the Smithsonian Learning Lab platform, which is a really incredible online resource of all kinds of historical documents and images, etc. So these are specially curated just for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So the collections thematically organize photos of objects, documents, imagery, and videos, helping visitors view history through the lens of the experience of Black Americans. So the sample that I'm recommending is a collection called Daily Acts of Resistance, which gathers items that illustrate how African Americans fought slavery and inequality in big ways and more subtle ways. And this is a quote from the page that introduces it. Using connections, family, neighbors, worship services, and formal political conventions, African Americans shared news, created networks, and developed strategies. Their persistence and grassroots organizing still serve as a model for social activists today. And this collection, this is just a side note, reminds me a lot of the interview that I did with Hassan Kwame Jeffries years ago, where he talked about the way that we have typically taught slavery in our schools has been only by portraying the harm that was done to the enslaved people and not any of their acts of resistance and not the ways that they fought back, and that only hearing how they were oppressed did not empower students. And one of his recommendations is that we shift our lens to also looking at all of the resistance that happened during all of these different periods. And so I think this collection here from the museum is a great example of including those acts of resistance and giving them just as much of a place of importance as telling the stories of the injustices and the oppression. So the final resource is a little bit different than the others. It is called Voice of Witness. So this one differs from the rest in that it is built around a series of published books rather than free online resources. But the work here is way too important to overlook. So the mission of Voice of Witness is to amplify unheard voices, to tell first-person oral histories of people who are most deeply impacted by injustice, but whose voices are usually never heard, such as wrongfully convicted Americans, undocumented immigrants, agricultural workers, indigenous peoples, and communities displaced from public housing, just for a few examples. So the books themselves are for purchase, although they do have some programs where schools can apply for grants and that sort of thing to get book sets for free. But most of them are for sale. But as a supplement, Voice of Witness offers an education program with free lesson plans, toolkits to empower students to create their own oral histories, and other supports for educators. So to learn more about the organization, you can also listen to an interview I did with their education director, Cliff Mayod, in 2018, which is episode 105. And so the sample that I would recommend, it comes from one of the more recent books that they have published called Me Maria, Surviving the Storm. This is a collection of stories from people affected by the 2017 Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And what I have linked you to is actually a free excerpt from that book that was written by Belle Marie Torres Velasquez, who is a doctor. And her piece is called How Do You Deliver a Baby in the Middle of a Storm with One Generator, No Water, and No Electricity? So you can get a taste of the kinds of stories that are offered in the Voice of Witness series by reading that excerpt. So I'm going to read through this list one last time just to remind you. The 1619 Project, the Zinn Education Project, Facing History and Ourselves, New American History, What Does It Mean to Be an American, Teaching Hard History Podcast, Queer America Podcast, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and Voice of Witness. This collection is probably just a drop in a big bucket of excellent history resources that are out there just waiting to be discovered. So if you know of other books, films, websites, and other resources that shine a light on all the parts of history that are currently being shoved under a rug, please come over to the site and share them in the comments. And again, for links to all of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 198. To get a bi-monthly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.